Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Oppenheimer, a movie about the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who led the team that made the first atomic bomb, is a box office hit this season. It's a serious movie that surprisingly is right up there with mass market favorites like Barbie, Spider-Man, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Along with the late Martin Sherwin, Kai Bird is co-author of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the book on which the movie is based. He's also executive director of the Levy Center for Biography at CUNY. He'll tell us why he thinks ordinary citizens are so interested in this serious man who undertook a deadly mission, why biography is important, and why the Oppenheimer story offers a lesson for our time. Welcome.
Thank you, Sheryl.
As I said, Oppenheimer, the movie, reportedly earned more than $800 million globally in its first 6 weeks. Are you surprised that so many people are interested in the story of a theoretical physicist who led the building of the atomic bomb?
Well, yes, I am surprised, but it is a good story, and he's a complicated, fascinating figure. And I think the real answer to your question is Christopher Nolan, the brilliant Hollywood director who chose to do this film based on the book. He has done just a tremendously artistic take on the Oppenheimer story. And I think most people, most ordinary citizens had no idea who J. Robert Oppenheimer was, particularly of a younger generation. Maybe they knew he was father of the atomic bomb, but that would be about it. But it is a very human, complicated story. And I'm the biographer, and I have to be one lucky biographer because Nolan has done just a brilliant film that is faithful to the book.
Your co-author, Mark Sherwin, worked on the book for more than 20 years before he approached you about working on the book. What kind of help did he want from you, and why did you say yes?
Well, Marty Sherwin was a great historian, and yes, he started working on Oppenheimer. He signed a contract with Alfred Knopf, the publisher, in 1980. And about 20 years later, he came to me, and he was a funny guy, very charming, and he invited me to join him on this biographical project. And he said that if I refused, his gravestone was going to read, "He took it with him." But biography is really an arduous process. It's very rigorous scholarship, and most biographies take at least 5, often 10 years. And Marty just spent 20 years researching. He gathered 50,000 pages of archival documents, 8,000 pages of FBI documents. He did 150 interviews, all neatly transcribed. And he still was unsatisfied. He still thought there was more research to be done, one more archive to bury into, and one more person to interview. So he got biographer's disease, which is when you can't stop researching and you can't start to write.
So did he basically need you to help him pull all of this stuff together?
He did. And I started to write using his research materials and wrote a draft of the first chapter on the childhood years. And then that instigated Marty to start writing.
Okay.
And we went back and forth, and it turned into a wonderful collaboration, and he had just very rich material. And the Oppenheimer story is just incredible. He's, a quantum physicist, but he loves English poetry and the novels of Ernest Hemingway. I mean, he's a polymath. He acquired an interest in Hindu scripture, so he learned Sanskrit so he could learn to read the scripture, the Gita, in the original. And then he becomes, the director of the scientific project to build this gadget.
Many dimensions of the man.
Many dimensions.
What do you see as the purpose of biography?
Oh, it is the best vehicle for conveying history. And you know, we human beings need to understand our world, and so we tell stories to each other, and that's how we sort of understand where we are in this complicated world. And biography is just a very compelling vehicle. It's about one person and his times or her times, and it's a page turner because it's so personal. Because it's so personal, it's credible to the reader, so they keep reading. And you learn a lot of history along the way.
What were the biggest challenges of writing this book?
Quantum physics.
Well, yes. I'm not going to ask you to describe what it was, but you do describe that in the book.
A little bit. There's not a lot of physics in this book, but we had to explain what Oppenheimer was doing in the 1920s and 30s on the cutting edge of this new science that explains the small world. And he was brilliant. He could hear the music, as they say. He wasn't a particularly good mathematician. He was very awkward as an experimental physicist. He broke things in the laboratory all the time. But he had an ability to imagine the implications of Einstein's initial theories on relativity. Because of his polymath, the fact that he was interested in literature as well, he could explain it in plain English. So that was that made him unique.
You have all of these brilliant scientists around him at Los Alamos who are trying to work out various problems, and you said he had the ability to put his finger on what the problem exactly was, so that they could proceed.
Yes, yeah, he had never managed more than a few graduate students at Berkeley. And then he's selected to become the scientific director of this secret city in the middle of the desert of New Mexico. And he brings together all these big egoed scientists, physicists, chemists, engineers. And his management style was one where he would sort of stand at the back of the room and let everyone have their piece and argue amongst themselves about the way forward. And then he could step forward just at the right moment and summarize, synthesize what people were saying. And in doing so, he would sort of point the way forward to solve the problem at hand.
Like a college or university professor, which I think, your job is to make complicated things clear.
Yes.
There are two dramatic arcs in the book. The first is about the successful completion of the first atomic bomb and, finishing it and testing it and using it in Japan. Was he the most famous scientist in the world after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Absolutely. Albert Einstein was right up there, but by 1947, Oppenheimer had his image put on the cover of Time and Life, and he had become director of the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was Albert Einstein's boss, so to speak.
Right.
But so yes, he was the most famous scientist in America. But Marty Sherwin, my co-author, the late Marty Sherwin, once he turned to me as we were writing this book, and he said, Kai, you and I wouldn't be spending so many years working on this book if it was just a story about the father of the atomic bomb, if it was just a story about building this gadget, this weapon of mass destruction. What gave the story an arc was the tragedy, the fall. And I think that's what you were about to refer to.
Right, that's the second arc.
Yeah.
His being subjected to kangaroo court that labeled him a security risk to the country because of his alleged ties to communists in the past, and stripped him of his security clearance to obtain information about the weapons program. Tell me about that.
Well, it was a terribly unfair trial. It was a security hearing. Took place over a month in secret in Washington. And his life was just stripped away, and he was interrogated about his love life, his politics, his associations with the Communist Party, and eventually they voted to deem him a security risk and possibly disloyal as an American citizen and possibly a spy for the Russians, none of which was true. It was, there was no evidence of this. They were going after him because he had come out against the development of the hydrogen bomb. And he was against relying on these weapons of mass destruction. And he was the father of the atomic bomb, warning the American people that these are dangerous weapons. And so he became a threat to the sort of national security establishment, and that's why they brought him down.
So the motivations were partly political, but they were also partly personal. I mean, there was some trivial stuff. I'm talking about Edward Teller and also Louis Strauss.
Yes. Louis Strauss was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, the new president, in 1953 to be chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And in that capacity, Louis Strauss was working with Oppenheimer, and he came to believe that Oppenheimer was a security risk. They had different politics, but he also was offended by Oppenheimer's arrogance and his, the fact that he had insulted Strauss. And so it was bad chemistry.
It butted up against his own arrogance,
yes,
right?
Exactly. And then you see this in the movie very vividly, the clash between Louis Strauss and Oppenheimer. And Strauss orchestrated virtually a conspiracy to bring Oppenheimer down. And it was personal, but it was also politics and differences over policy.
And Edward Teller, who was another scientist, his issue was that Oppenheimer didn't favor the development of a hydrogen bomb, an even bigger and badder bomb.
Exactly.
What did you learn from working on this book that surprised you?
Oh, there are endless mysteries about Oppenheimer. He's very complicated. His love life, his relationship with his wife, Kitty, his politics, the mystery about how close to the Communist Party was he in the 1930s? Did he actually join the party or not? Marty and I concluded that he never joined the party, never submitted himself to party discipline, but he gave a lot of money to causes of the Communist Party. In Berkeley, he supported a campaign to desegregate the public swimming pool in Berkeley. He raised money to send an ambulance to the Spanish Republic in the midst of the Spanish Civil War. He was becoming increasingly politically active in the 1930s in the midst of the Depression, which is no surprise. Many American intellectuals moved to the left during this economic crisis called the Depression, and so did Oppenheimer. And then he paid for it. These associations were in the height of the McCarthy era. He became the chief celebrity victim of the whole McCarthy witch hunts. And so that story is too very relevant to our own times. It explains to this day some of our divisive politics. There's a direct link between the McCarthy era and our own divisive partisan politics today.
One thing that surprised me was that at least both the scientists and certainly the politicians at the time were concerned not just about stopping Hitler, because he was almost defeated at this time, or even about stopping Japan, because Japan was almost defeated. They were concerned about the Soviet Union and not letting the Soviet Union get the bomb.
Yes, that was a factor, we believe. Germany was defeated by May of 1945. The first atomic device was tested at Trinity in New Mexico in July of 1945, and the Japanese were virtually already defeated. They were negotiating behind the scenes for the terms of surrender. And in the back of the mind of certainly Truman's Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, was the notion that this new weapon of mass destruction would be sort of a pistol in his pocket that he could display to the Soviets to keep them in line in the aftermath of World War II. And that was one of their notions, that by demonstrating this terrible weapon and hopefully keeping a monopoly on this weapon of mass destruction, that it would keep the Soviets in check after the war.
So the nuclear arms race that Oppenheimer feared might happen started almost immediately. I know that there have been a number of non-proliferation treaties and whatever aimed at preventing the development and use of nuclear weapons. But are they working?
Well, tragically, Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, 3 months after Hiroshima, he gives a speech in which public speech in Philadelphia, in which he says, these are weapons for aggressors. These are weapons of terror. And they were used in the first instance on a virtually already defeated enemy. And then he goes on to warn about the dangers of proliferation. He says, you may think these are very expensive weapons because we spent $2 billion. Actually, they are cheap, and there are no secrets to building them. The physics is known, and any country, however poor and small, if they decide to build these weapons, they will be able to do so. So he was predicting our world today, where North Korea has atomic weapons, and Pakistan, and India, and China, and Israel, and France, and England. I mean, and this is a dangerous world. And Oppenheimer was urging President Truman and then Eisenhower and others to understand that the priority was to try to contain this new technology, regulate it, have international controls, ban the bomb, have inspections of factories and laboratories everywhere to make sure that people couldn't build these weapons. And all of this advice was ignored, and instead his worst nightmare was we had an arms race in the midst of the Cold War.
Thankfully, nobody has used them, but I was shocked to learn that at one point, and that was a long time ago, the United States had 70,000 nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it's tens of thousands, and we've now built down, and so we're going in the right direction, but it's still a very dangerous world. And you're right, of course, these weapons haven't been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in combat, but the story's not over. And, knowing the foibles of human nature and our tendency towards complacency, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 100 years they are used again. And we're facing a war in Ukraine now, where the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, has actually threatened the use of these
tactically, supposedly.
Supposedly battlefield weapons. But
you mentioned earlier that you feel that there are stories to be learned, lessons to be learned from the Oppenheimer story. Is one of them that politics should not be allowed to overpower the truth?
Well, here is a scientist, America's most famous scientist in 1945, who is brought down in 1954 in this terrible secret trial and humiliated. And that sent a lesson to all scientists, not to get out of your narrow lane, not to attempt to become a public intellectual and talk about policy or advise people about politics. And that's a sad affair because we live in a very complicated world drenched in science and technology, right? And yet we should be referring to our scientists to get some kind of guidance on
about how to use
all this stuff. And instead, as we saw during the recent pandemic, scientists are distrusted by the common citizen too often. And public health officials during the pandemic, scientists who were trying to advise how to deal with this terrible scourge in a public health way, were questioned. Their integrity was questioned. And I think this all goes back to what happened to Oppenheimer. It symbolizes what happened, what has happened to the role of scientists in our society.
As I said earlier, you are the executive director of the Levy Center for Biography at CUNY. Tell me about what the center does.
Well, we exist to sort of promote the art and craft of biography, which is, I would argue, the most rigorous scholarship there is in terms of history and telling human stories. And it's a very expensive form of scholarship. Most of these biographers take 5 to 10 years to write their books. So we give out 5 fellowships a year at $72,000 a pop, and provide them office space and library privileges, and we meet once a month and critique each other's work. It's a terrific program, and it's been going on since 2007, and it's very unique. It's the only institution in the country that promotes and supports working biographers, so it's a great thing.
What kind of advice do you give to a fledgling biographer?
Write every day and write your footnotes as you go along and try to keep your subject, the figure that you're writing about, somewhere on the page. Don't stray too far from your subject in telling your narrative, and keep at it.
How do you start? Where do you start?
You start in the archives. You start doing interviews if there are people around who knew your subject. Sometimes, biographers choose to write books on living subjects. That's even harder to do because the living are more difficult than the dead.
Yeah. And sometimes, a biography is not always about a famous figure. Sometimes it's about an unknown figure
Absolutely.
that you want to bring to life, right?
Yeah, that's become a very popular genre in recent years, to write biographies about the unknown, the common citizen, the forgotten. And that too is a useful historical narrative. And the venue of memoir has become very popular as well. And memoir and biography, they're different, but they're in the same storytelling field.
You are working on a biography of Roy Cohn, the lawyer, fixer, red baiter, society hound. I just finished reading a biography of Roy Cohn, and there's a lot that's been written about him. There's this big biography that I just read and articles. Why do you think he needs another biography?
Well, there is one good biography. You read it. It's by Nick von Hoffman. It appeared in 1988, and it was based all on journalistic interviews, not much archival research. And suddenly the Roy Cohn story is much more relevant to our times today, because Roy Cohn was not only chief of staff to Joe McCarthy in the McCarthy era, he then became, in 1973, he befriended a young real estate developer here in New York City named Donald Trump. And he became Trump's lawyer for the next dozen years and taught Donald Trump everything he knew about how to deal with the press, how to double down, how to never apologize, how to countersue. He taught Donald Trump his politics, and it's a very divisive, confrontational form of politics. And so I thought, writing about Roy Cohn would explain something about my world, and that's the aim of any biography, is to try to understand our very complicated world.
There's also a new biography of Martin Luther King that just came out. And when I heard that, somebody sent me the book, and I said, well, I've already read biographies. I know a lot about Martin Luther King, but I guess that sometimes for each new generation needs a new take, a new look.
This is a very interesting biography by Jonathan Eig, I think it is. And, you know, what happens is the years roll by and the biographer, historian stumbles across new evidence, new
Right.
stories that have been buried in the archives. And that's what Ike has done with King, I think.
Yeah.
And there have been new FBI documents released, and he tells a much more sort of human, personal story about
Yeah.
King, this iconic figure of the civil rights movement, and that's an important thing to do too. And it couldn't be done. It was too early to be done right after King's assassination. You know, but as the decades roll by, you can have a different take.
What do you want the readers of your book and the viewers of the movie to take away from the Oppenheimer story?
Well, I think there are sort of three major things that the viewers of the film and the readers of the book can take away. One is that we shouldn't be complacent about nuclear weapons. They're very dangerous. Oppenheimer gave us the nuclear age, and it's never going to be over, and we have to figure out a way to live with it, and that's going to be very difficult. The second thing is to understand the importance of the McCarthy era that we're still living with. The seeds of that terrible political witch hunt in the 1950s is still with us, and it's poisoned our political landscape. The third thing is to understand the importance of scientists in our world that is drenched with science and technology, and to learn to study the lives of scientists can help us to understand our world.
There was certainly a lot of content in your book. I mean, there were a lot of characters, there was a lot of science, there was a lot of politics, there was a lot of personal stuff, all very fascinating. And I thank you for making all of this often complicated stuff clear.
Well, thank you, Sheryl. Thank you for reading.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Kai Bird, Executive Director of the Levy Center for Biography at CUNY, and author of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.